And we are kicking off with a session on co-producing with Europe. As many of you know, Canada is one of the most prolific co-production countries in the world. And that goes two ways. We go to foreign countries and make films with partners, and they also come here and do films with us. One of our speakers here today, Kevin DeWalt from Mind's Eye Entertainment, is a prolific co-producer and has made 4 co-productions with our French company, who's represented here today by Nicolas Manuel, and in the last 4 years, which is very impressive. I'm going to, just one of the things about doing this particular session that I'd like to mention is the French government contacted us, and they told us that there's been a change in the French tax credit laws, and they were eager that we would discuss this today because in the past, with doing co-productions with France, the vast majority of co-productions with France and Canada came out of Quebec because they were French language co-productions. That's now been opened up, and that will be discussed somewhat on the session today as well, so that non-French co-productions can be shot in France so that we can leverage the French tax credit for those as well. So that'll be touched on, as well as many other things. We're delighted to have the session sponsored by BC Film. And I would like to introduce you to our moderator today, who is Kim Roberts, who's one of Western Canada's top entertainment lawyers. He's also a producer, a partner in Roberts and Stahl, and he has co-produced, produced, and executive produced a number of films, including It's All Gone Pete Tong, Partition, A Shine of Rainbows, and recently a documentary called And the Beat Goes On. Please note, at the end of the panel, we have the next session. We have to do some tech setup beforehand, so if you are waiting for the next session, please leave after the session, then you can re-enter once we're ready. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Ellen. Could I get just a show of hands on people here in the audience who have been involved in co-productions in the past? Well, that's good. It looks like almost half, so that's great. We're not going to spend a lot of time on talking about, generally the advantages of co-production and, how you find your partners and that sort of thing, sort of more general questions. What we plan to do is give you a bit of an overview, and Sandra's going to talk a little bit about the co-production situation generally in Canada. And then we've got Nicolas and Kevin to talk more specifically about a couple of case studies. They've worked together on 4 co-productions, which in my experience is almost unique. Most people don't want to see each other again after they've done 1 co-production, and to do 4 together means that they obviously got along very well, or the films made money, or both. But we've got, as I say, a very unusual situation that we have 2 people who have, first of all, so much experience, but also have actually worked together over that period of time. I'd like to start with Sandra, though, who has been at Telefilm for the last 10 years. She came from distribution, and so she actually knows a lot about the industry from that experience, but she's been the head of business affairs and also of co-production for Telefilm for how many years, Sandra?
4.
4 years. And could you talk a little bit about what it is that you do at Telefilm?
Sure. So I'm the Director of Business Affairs. Under Business Affairs is the Business Affairs Department, but also the Co-Production Certification Department. Policy and whatnot, of course, is driven by the Department of Heritage, and we certify on their behalf. I don't pick the projects. That's another department, project financing, and that's led by Michel Pradier and his team. First, a project for financing would come in to us. Their team would vet it, and if they're interested in it creatively and the team and whatnot, then they'll ask my department to take a look at the business affairs aspects. We would look at the budget, the financing, that kind of thing, and give him our thoughts on how easy the project would be to close, what the hurdles would be, where we might see some problems. And after he gets the input of his creative team and our team, he decides, or his people decide, whether or not to go ahead with financing the project. At that point, it comes over to my team again, and we close it. We close the financing, contract it, and then disperse based on a percentage of completion. That's project financing. Co-production certification is a different department, and there's no financing tied to that. When you achieve certification, it makes you eligible to apply to as a Canadian production in Canada and a French production in France, and gives you access to the various financing instruments for domestic production. Doesn't guarantee you're going to get it, but it means you can apply. So things like tax credits, things like Canada Feature Film Fund financing, Canada Media Fund if you're a television project, various provincial funds. The broadcasters in Canada are obligated to license CanCon, and so you might get a better license because now you're considered Canadian content. So it opens up an area of financing that wouldn't be available to you, say, if you were doing a service production in the United States. In terms of co-production, we have 53 treaties, more than any other country in the world. We do not have a treaty with the United States. So you can't do a treaty co-production with the United States. We have various other tax credit mechanisms to assist people who are working with the Americans. Last year we certified 61 productions, about half and half film and television. And specifically with respect to France, about a third of the productions that we certified out of France were English language. Is that enough, Kim?
That's getting there, that's for sure. Okay. And, well, just to follow up on that, as you mentioned, we've got treaties with, I think, more countries than any other country in the world. So we're considered to be the queen or the king of co-productions, I think, in the world. But it sounds from what you're saying that most of the co-productions we're doing are focused on France and the United Kingdom.
And
is
the
that
UK.
right? UK?
Yeah, about 40 of the 61 we did last year were either France or the UK.
Okay, and we talked about this yesterday. You're not really seeing any particular trends in the co-productions that are being done. The majority are being done with France and UK, and then the rest is somewhat random. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, every year we do, 3 or 4 with Germany, Italy, primarily because Robert Lantos tends to work a lot with Italy.
I see.
Last year we did 2 with South Africa, but that was really script-driven. The story was set in South Africa. So when you get to the 2 or 3 co-productions a year with a country, it's not really a trend. It's almost entirely creatively driven. It just so happens the script lends itself to being a co-production. But the UK and France is more because over time we've established a relationship with them, and obviously the English-French thing.
Right. Good. Okay. And what I'd like to do is introduce Nicholas and Kevin then. Nicholas has been with Forecast Pictures for 7 years doing business affairs there. And if any of you have experience with business affairs, you'll know that it means you do everything. You do the casting, you deal with the financing, you deal with all of the problems of the business. You basically do everything from soup to nuts in the company. And Forecast, I think, is a very unusual kind of company. And maybe, Nicholas, you can explain a bit more about that.
So Forecast Pictures was founded in 2003 by Jean-Charles Levy, who was before an executive for TF1 International, and who was based for a while in Los Angeles, where he was the head of TF1 USA. And from this experience, he created the company to do some consulting in international film financing for French producers, but also for foreign producers who wanted to set up English-speaking movies or who wanted to go into co-productions. Quickly after our first project, we also became real producers, per se, and we have now been involved in 7 different feature films, 4 of which with Kevin here. All of them English-speaking, but 1. We made a French-speaking movie in 2006. It was kind of a follow-up with the director we had worked before on an English-speaking movie, and so we helped him out on this one. But it's true that there's only a few. There's a couple big French mini studios, such as Europa Corp, that does English-speaking movies, but there's maybe 2 or 3 companies only that work and develop English language movies in France.
Great.
And
Thanks.
we're one of them.
Mm-hmm. And we've got Kevin, who, as Nicholas mentioned, has worked together on 4 projects with Forecast, and we're fortunate to have Kevin. Kevin's done more than 50 productions over his time. He's been in business for more than 26 years at Mind's Eye in Saskatchewan, and who would have thought a producer from Saskatchewan would be doing as many co-productions as Kevin's done? You've done how many co-productions, Kevin?
9.
9?
9 treaties.
And four of those were with France.
Yeah.
Who else have you done co-productions with?
We've done 2 with Ireland, 1 with the UK, 2 in Germany, 1 in Switzerland, and 4 in France.
Right, and you just finished a $20 million thriller with Jessica Biel, is that right?
Correct, yeah.
What was that?
It was called The Tall Man.
And where'd you shoot that?
We actually shot in Nelson, British Columbia,
Really?
for 7 weeks, and then we shot 1 week in studio in Regina.
So of the 4 co-productions that you've done, how many have been shot in France?
None.
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 Oh, I see. So the model you've been using then is to shoot the films in Canada and then to post in France, is that right?
Sometimes the post is done in Canada.
Yeah.
We've done, or split in between the two. On Tallman, the audio post is being done in France, and part of the special effects, but just
Yeah.
a little part. And then I think on the other projects, most of the post was done here in Canada.
Yeah.
Now, I said we wouldn't talk about dating, but I'm just curious, how did the two of you, your two companies, start working together?
Well, maybe I'll take that one. Actually, there was a project called Walled In with Misha Barton, which was basically written and was going to be directed by a French director and writer. And they were actually scouting in Montreal to shoot it as a France-Quebec co-production. And when they got to Montreal, they did the scout, they did a budget, and the budget came out about $1 million higher than what they had. And I think it was a recommendation from somebody else that both Jean-Charles and I know, who suggested that you should maybe check with Kevin. So really how it happened was we got sent the script because I have internal business affairs and production and accounting. We actually very quickly did a breakdown and a budget, and we showed that we could actually make the movie for $1 million less in Saskatchewan. So I think they perked up. Literally within 3 or 4 days, they came to Saskatchewan for a scout. And primarily that movie is a build. The entire building was basically built in studio. And Regina has this wonderful soundstage complex that has 4 big stages and a big water tank and all the facilities. So I think that, and it's also reasonably priced. And we have a very strong construction department. So that was really how it came to us, by fluke, I guess, at one level. And
So you were a friend with benefits then?
friend with benefits, yeah. So we set it up as a treaty co-pro, we shot it, and we got along very, very well. And really, co-production, I've never really co-produced a second movie with anybody. I mean, I've done lots of co-productions one time, but it is so hard, it's so difficult, there's so much, heartache and headache. Because you're moving around, each country's treaties. You've got to keep to the treaties, and you can't vary in terms of your spends. And quite often, it ends up you finish the movie and you deliver, but it's been so exhausting that you rarely go back and do it again with the same partner. In the case of Jean-Charles and Nicholas, it was such a great experience, and I think our teams got along very, very well. We were very efficient. We had to move quickly. And, Mind's Eye comes with a bit of a track record in Canada in terms of banking and some financial wherefore-all, so we came to the plate on that front. And really, we haven't looked back, and we've done 4, and we've got 2 more on the table that we're both working on right now as well. So it'll be 6 within 5 years.
Well, that's interesting because, the common wisdom has been, and I've been on a number of panels now regarding co-production, and people say over and over again, well, you have to find the project that fits with the co-production model. You have to find something that actually makes sense, it's a French story, or if you're doing it in France, or it's a British story, or whatever. But I think the message I'm getting here, and it certainly, as I said, is a unique situation, is that, in fact, it's the relationship that drives the co-production, not the project itself. And I'm sure that it's not completely in that way, but it seems to me that you're a very strong example of a relationship actually driving where the projects are done.
Well, we're both very commercial driven.
Right.
And that's critical. I mean, I'm not a art film house. I don't make art movies. I don't plan to. We want to make movies that do well and that are seen. And we made a decision 5 years ago to really focus on commercial-driven projects. And I think JC, with his experience with TF1, which is a very commercial-driven studio in France, and his experience in LA for those 2 or 3 years that he lived there, to get anything made as an independent movie at the budget level that we're doing, and we're in the budget levels of sort of 10 to 20 million. If it's not commercial and not star-driven, there's not a hope in hell that you'll get it made. And I think that's one of the main reasons why we see eye to eye, is that we both have the same vision in terms of what we want to do. We want movies to make money. And if Telefilm's involved, we want Telefilm to make money. We want everybody to make money. And, you know, it doesn't happen overnight. It's a process. You learn a lot. You know, we learned a lot on the first one. We made a lot of mistakes. Second one, we did better. And I think, you know, we're now on our fourth one called The Tall Man, which is, you know, a $19 million movie. We think it's very commercial. We're in the post-production, final stages of post-production. And, you know, we're very optimistic that it's going to do very well. So, and I think the next two that we have that are even one step above those. So I think you just learn, you get better, and you take more risks. And but definitely, it's the relationship that is the key in our co-productions for sure.
Well, I think also what you've said as well is that you've done it over and over again. So by the time you get to the fourth, you've been able to eliminate some of the problems you had in the first few, so that it becomes a question of efficiency at that point, doesn't
Definitely.
it? Yeah. Now, you mentioned you might be doing something in Indonesia. Is that going to be a Canada-France co-production?
Well, look, we're doing, we've actually got two projects that are set in Asia, and we're in the process of deciding how to set it up. And it really comes down to where the cast comes from. One project's called A Dream of Red Mansions. It's actually set in China, but we won't be able to shoot in China because of its, you know, its relevant story. It doesn't work. Chinese government will not allow this movie to be shot there. So right now it's set up as a French, Canada, Singapore treaty co-production. But we may end up flipping it as a Canadian, Singapore, Australian co-production, and France will just be a financial partner, because we're going after a very big Australian female star to play the lead. And if
there wouldn't be many choices there, would there?
There's a couple. And, you know, so that'll drive that side of it, because Screen Australia will participate financially as an investor if we lock the star and do it as an Aussie co-pro. Singapore will invest because they have their media fund as well, and they're quite aggressive. And I was there a few weeks ago where they're really looking at, you know, English language. This is a $23 million movie. They'd love to have it come. And it just happens that Indonesia, the island of Batam, is very close to Singapore. It's about 20 minutes by ferry. And one of the major studio owners and production companies in Singapore actually got a studio on this island. But because their head office is in Singapore, they qualify as a Singapore company. As long as you take the Singapore crew to this island, it still qualifies as a Singapore production. And of course, in Canada, there is some North American shooting in this movie, so we'll shoot that in Canada.
And then
so
post in Australia?
And then post in Australia, yeah. Now, if the Australian actor doesn't come through, then there's no reason to do it as an Aussie co-pro. Then we'd probably go back to a France, Canada, Singapore co-production. There'd be some French elements that would come in as well. So it's really a horse trade.
And one interesting thing is that more than co-producers, we became really partners, and we'll try to get each other involved in any other projects. Maybe not the projects we would do 100% in France, and probably not the projects you would do 100% in Canada. But as soon as you're looking at something international, we try to get each other involved, because we know we're complementary on financing, on production aspects. And so even if it's not at some point a French-Canadian co-production, as you say, on this project with Singapore, we could still get involved in other ways than through a treaty co-production. That's very specific to our relationship, of course.
Right. And the nice thing is that out of Canada and out of France, there's actually quite a bit of money that can be pulled, not just from government financing sources, but from other sources as well. So in fact, it's an ideal partnership because of what you're able to pull from your jurisdictions. So what I'd like to do is talk us through specific aspects of a co-production, talking about development to begin with, then talking about how the projects get financed. And as you can hear from Nicholas and Kevin, that there's a lot of creativity involved in how you finance a co-production. And then to talk about production itself, that is, how does it actually work during co-production. So just starting with development, what I'd like to do, Sandra, is just start with you and talk about what money is available in Canada for development of a co-production. And I guess the question is twofold. First of all, what money is available for development? But secondly, how does it work if you've got a co-production and you want to receive development money in Canada?
It's rare to see something come in at the development stage already structured as a co-production because it's expensive to lay out the agreement and whatnot, and so you really don't do that until you're pretty sure you're going to go to production.
So what you're saying is most people will come in without having a co-producing partner to begin with for development.
And they will develop, you know, if the writer's Canadian, they'll probably come to Canada and do the development that way, or if it's French, they'll go through France. We do see them from time to time. They are eligible to come to the Canada Feature Film Fund for development. And if they're an international co-production, we will even address the non-Canadian writing costs.
So you may be able to get money for a non-Canadian writer from Telefilm.
Right.
Oh, that's interesting.
But only to the extent that the co-producing country is also participating. So we would like to see development funding from the CNC.
Does it have to be equal, or is it in proportion?
It has to be proportionate, yeah. The guidelines are a little vague on it, so we have a little discretion there, yeah. We also have a very specific development fund for French language co-production, and it's run, the jury who decides on them is run out of Namur. And so it's not just for France, but also Belgium, all the French-speaking countries in Europe. And it's a small fund, and it's a pretty new fund, 2 or 3 years old. But we do participate in that. And then you can get development financing from the CMF if it's a television project. And in that case, the broadcasters are actually the people who are deciding.
Right, they'll drive it in that situation.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah. And we have some very specific French language funds run out of the Montreal office, Écriolon and French Outside Quebec, and those are smaller funds that are specifically targeted at underrepresented groups.
Right. Okay, and Nicholas, could you talk a little bit about what's available in France for development?
Well, officially in France, the only development money you can get is for French-speaking movies. So I guess the development monies that would be accessible within co-productions would be only on French-speaking projects.
So if it's an English language project, you can forget getting any development money in France?
Yes, what you can do, or also because you don't always know a project will end up in English when you start working on it, is get money for the project as a French-speaking project where at least it's a script written in French.
Right.
And then when it becomes English, you have to pay back this development money, obviously, to the CNC.
So you pretend it's a French project, isn't it?
It's not this way. The script is written in French, then translated, and then you get the CNC their money back.
Right, okay. That's great. And well, then, going to our case study then, and maybe just you can talk generally about how you did your English language projects. I mean, how you did 4 co-productions. How did you develop the projects in each case?
You want me to tackle
please.
it? Everyone's different. No two are the same, as we know, but maybe using 2 examples. So one movie was shot in Saskatchewan called Lullaby for Pie, starring Forrest Whitaker, Rupert Friend, Clemence Posey, and Sarah Wayne Kelly, who's our Canadian. And in that particular case, we applied to SAS Film for some early money, and SAS Film came in for some packaging development money. That was matched by our French distributor, who also put in some matching money, but we did not go after Telefilm, we did not go after the CNC.
Why was that? I mean, why did you
Well,
decide
I think
not
part
to
of
do
it
that?
is timing. A lot of times when these things come together, they come together based on cast. And when you're in a packaging phase, you've got a cast who's committed, you have a window that you've got to get it done in, and there isn't time to do the application. Because, it takes time to get an application through any organization. And what you end up doing, unfortunately, but it's a reality, is the producers end up putting in the balance of the development to get it going. So all of a sudden, people are flying everywhere, location scouting is being done, applications are going into the treaty office. These are all expenses, and if you were to wait for application and try and get some government support, you'd never get it made. Or you'd have to wait a year to get kind of through the development cycle. So that's one example where we had some SAS film money matched by some distribution money to get us sort of going. Faces in the Crowd, which was a movie another thriller that we did, shot that in Winnipeg. Mila Jovovich was our main star, and Julian McMahon was another star. That one had no development financing from anybody. That was 100% financed between Forecast and Mind's Eye. We didn't really have a budget. We just knew that once we locked Mila Jovovich, we had the window, we just started to spend money.
You had a movie.
Yeah, and we had credit cards. And as long as you've got an American Express where you can, have no limit and you don't have to pay it for, you have all your expenses come out the day after the cutoff, so you can get 2 months leverage on the money. You can finance it. And literally, we just had people flying around the country because we had to go into prep immediately. And then while we were basically in early prep, we were closing the financing. And without the business affairs team at Forecast and Mind's Eye, there's just no way that we would have gotten that project to first day of principal. And I must say, without the Telefilm treaty office, who were incredible on that film, and actually all the films, in terms of how quick they react. When you can show that you've got a go picture that's a treaty, they understand as well that these things all come together at the last minute. And to this day, we're always amazed how quick Telefilm deals with you as a treaty co-production out of the treaty office, and how reactive they are and how they're there to help solve your problems. Because, every day there's an issue that comes up in a treaty co-production through the application process.
It's a bit harder on the French side.
Yeah, and maybe you could talk
a little
bit
bit
about
harder on the French side. Yeah.
So primarily we've been self-developing. Fortunately, we get a lot of projects come to us, scripts from writers on spec.
Well, I was going to ask you about that, because obviously a big expense in development is paying for scripts, and how do you do that?
Well, we get scripts submitted all the time. There's a process within Mind's Eye where you fill out a submission form, you submit that, sort of goes into the pile. If we have a relationship with the writer or the director, or with a company like Forecast, if Nicholas sends us an English script, it goes to the top of the pile immediately, and we usually get back to him within 48 hours if it's something that we think that we can help finance. Very rarely do we pay a writer to write a script. We do that. There are some exceptions. If it's a book, like we have the rights to The Last Crossing, which is a Guy Vanderhaeghe. I did The Englishman's Boy, which was one of his first books. He's a brilliant writer. The Last Crossing is going to be an amazing film. That one, we've got a slower development process. Telefilm has been involved in that one. Harold Greenberg Fund, SAS Film. And also, if we've got young writers who we think have a lot of talent, we'll also take a little bit more time and help develop them. We really do like to develop new talent. So, there's only so much money in the system. And I think the reality of it is that, a company, any company, probably is not going to get more than 1 or 2 projects developed with Telefilm and SAS Film involved in my case. There just isn't enough money in the system. There's way too many companies and way too many projects. So you have to be very, very selective and very passionate about the one that you want the government support on, because you've got to go in and sell it and sell that this is the one that's going to get made. I think it's a little bit different in France on the CNC side.
It is, and I was thinking of this particular project, Faces in the Crowd. We actually got the script. It was very in an advanced phase, but the director was working on other projects, French-speaking, TV, etc., on the side. But he wanted this, he's the screenwriter and director, he wanted this project to be made in English, and so he came to us with this film, because we had this track record of producing English-speaking movies with Canada, knowing that there was a chance that it would be made. So, he wasn't only with this project, but he would, let us not pay him for a while because
That was very nice of him.
that was nice of him, but he knew that we had a chance to make this movie, and we actually made it. So I think everybody was happy at the end of the day.
Right, it was worth the gamble on his part. Well, and I do want to reinforce what Kevin's saying, and that is that if you have something that is going to go, or it has a potential to go quickly, two things. First of all, the Telefilm office can be very helpful in moving along that approval process and can do it, can turn around quite quickly and answer a lot of questions that you have. And I've found the office to be very helpful in doing that. And the second thing is having a partner that you trust, because there's a 9-hour time difference between, or 8 hours, I guess, between Saskatchewan and France. And so having someone you trust and a relationship you've built up with is really important, I think, in terms of making it happen that quickly. Because when stars are available and they have a certain window, and very often that's what happens, us poor indie producers who are scrambling to get cast sometimes have to move very quickly because if something is further out, no agent will let their star commit to something that's going to be 9 months from now. So very often it's, we got a window from December 15th to January 15th. If you can pull it off, we'll be there. Otherwise, we're moving on. And you have to be able to move very quickly in that situation.
I should just make a comment about time difference. Really, that's one of the most difficult things that you deal with is that 8 or 9 hours difference, because obviously, when their day starts, when their day ends, our day just starts. So, I mean, if you're going to get into European co-productions, I would advise you to start your day at 5 in the morning or 6 in the morning. That's what I do. I'm in the office at 5:30, specifically to deal with France, and because we deal with them every day on, now we've got 4 projects at various stages, and they stay late. So it's quite often, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, my time, I could still get these guys at 8 o'clock in the evening, their time. So
that's how you get a full working day, and you start
work
really
24
early, and they were
So you really have to be prepared to do some sacrifices that way, because if you come in at 9, 10 in the morning and it's already 6 o'clock at night in Paris, it'll take 2 to 3 days to get a single decision made. And when you're in the thick of it, you cannot wait 2 or 3 days on decisions. You need decisions every hour.
And what's really nice is that in the production offices, you can actually have people do that. Try to get the lawyers on your crew and the bankers to work the same hours you're working is a little trickier, and that's often what's going to create the bottleneck in terms of turning something around when there's that much of a time difference. And we'll talk a little bit about that when we talk about financing, which I think we should just move on to. The production financing for a co-production. Sandra, maybe you could start with what's available in Canada for with money, especially with Telefilm, for co-productions.
Well, once you're a treaty co-production, you're eligible to apply for all of the funding that a Canadian production would be able to apply for. So within.
Do you have to be certified though as a co-production in order to make the applications for financing?
No. If you're coming for production financing, say with the Canada Feature Film Fund, you have to apply for your co-pro certification at least 30 days before you commence principal. But if you're making a production application at the same time, I think the guidelines say within a week of the production application being filed, you should be filing your co-pro application.
Right.
Certainly there's a time in the production financing where the project is still in a creative evaluation, and so that's the time that you have to get it into co-pro, because once it comes to my team, the first people we're going to call are the co-pro people to say, do you have this application? Do you see any problems? It's not likely we will issue a contract without that preliminary recommendation, and we certainly won't issue any money.
So no money changes hands
Not
until
until
that's
done.
Right. And but are there situations where you will go to contract without if you think that if it looks like it's moving along?
If it's gone, if it's just a matter of timing with the co-pro analysts, where they've looked at it and they sort of say to us, we think it's fine, but I can't get the letter out till Monday or something. Yeah, we'd go.
Right.
Yeah.
And so Nicholas and Kevin, could you talk about how? Well, first of all, Nicholas, if you could talk about what's available in France from a government perspective for co-productions, and then what I'd like to hear from the two of you is how you actually
put together your projects.
Okay, so what I need to do there is to get a bit specific on how the French system of cinema funding works, because there's different levels. Basically, the CNC was created in the 60s to help the French movie industry. And one of the biggest...
So CNC?
Centre National de la Cinématographie.
Got it.
French Center for Cinema.
So yeah, we all luckily speak French and English here, right?
So the biggest thing that was created is the Fonds de soutien automatique, which in effect means every film that is made gets money from a special tax on theater tickets, basically $1 out of every ticket, French movies and non-French movies. And all this goes into a fund, and then the fund is redistributed into accounts for each movies. And the size of the monies that are given to a film depends on its success in theaters. And this money can be then reused for a next movie by the producer. It's a blocked account within the CNC, but he can use this money to do his next film.
So you can get a chunk of money, but you can't really use it in the current production you're doing.
No.
It's like banking some money for future productions.
Exactly.
It's like our performance envelope
Right.
system.
Yeah.
Where in Canada, if your film succeeds at the box office,
And is that more than $1 million in box office?
it depends on, it's different for French and English. For English, at the moment, I think you get about 81 cents on the dollar, but you have to hit about 900,000 to qualify even for a development envelope. It just depends on the calculation that year.
Right.
But it's the same thing. If your film has performed, and we also take into consideration things like awards at major festivals and whatnot, you will have a pot of money set aside for your next film. It's not your money. We don't put it into your account. It's still Telefilm money and has to comply with all the Telefilm requirements for recoupment and whatnot, but it's earmarked for your next film. And you don't go through a creative analysis, so we don't need to vet the script except for, production value and that sort of thing.
So it's there if you want to use it.
Yes. If you don't use it, we'll take it back.
So
Use
it gets
ourselves.
used, I guess.
Yeah.
And Nicholas, has that actually provided money for?
No, so
for you?
I'm getting there. The thing
Yeah.
is, if you produce an English-speaking movie, this amount is reduced by 75%.
Oh.
So basically, it's not very interesting. At the end of the day, you may be looking, instead of looking at least 50,000 euros, it comes down to 10, maybe 15, which is much less. A successful French movie can look at 300, 400, 500,000 euros for a film that can be reused, but that's obviously not the case for English-speaking movies. And you also have another discount if the movie you want to make thereafter is also an English-speaking movie.
So you get a further discount.
A
Is that
further discount.
for doing English.
So obviously there's a big incentive to do French-speaking movies. All the other accessible monies are also for French-speaking movies. So basically, you couldn't get any public money for an English-speaking from France, for an English-speaking French-Canadian co-production. This being said, when you do an official treaty co-production, you get the French nationality. And broadcasters in France and distributors have an obligation to fund a certain number of French movies every year. And this is not depending on the French language. You have a quota for French language movie, and then you have a quota for French nationality movies. And getting into these quotas means you're going to get, Kevin was saying that for Canada too, you're going to get much more money from the different private sector investors. Should it be Canal Plus as a broadcaster, different, that's pay TV, the different free TV broadcasters, even distribution. Having your French nationality is very important to get this financing up. So that's the real incentive of doing English-speaking movies through treaty co-production.
Well, it also qualifies as an EU movie
Yep.
in other territories. So if you're a treaty co-pro, it's a French movie in France, it's a Canada movie in Canada, but it's also considered an EU movie in Europe, and it qualifies for the EU quota. So if Belgium buys it, or Germany buys it, or Spain buys it, it's actually worth more to them as a qualifying movie. Now, not a heck of a lot more. You're not going to get, 25% more in terms of a buy, but you might get an extra 10% on the buy. Because
And
it's
do
so-
they get extra support, those other countries, for their distribution? I mean, is there some money available for that through media?
Yeah, I mean, if you qualify for Eurimage, which is another European PAN program, there's absolutely, you can get funding for a project that's European content, but also the buyers have access to funds as well to buy those movies in their territories. It's very similar in Canada. There's a distribution program, I think, still at Telefilm.
Just for the marketing, we don't
For the
fund,
marketing.
MGs anymore.
Yeah, so I think it's similar in various countries. Every country's got its own little, state or country programs, and then within those countries, like Canada, they have their provincial provinces programs. There's probably 150 programs in Europe. If you break down each country, each province, each city, there's some cities that have their own programs, like Zurich. I did a co-production in Switzerland. You actually have a Zurich film program, you have a state program that city is in, then you have the country program. So there's 3 levels. It's a quagmire. I mean, it's unbelievable amount of paperwork to get through some of these things if you want to go that route. We tend to try to keep them as simple as possible.
Germany
Could you
has a lot
talk a
of
little
those.
bit about that? How have you done this? And it sounds like you didn't receive Telefilm funding for any of the 4 projects you did as a
No.
co-production. So how did you put it together?
Well, let me break down Faces in the Crowd, because I think
Okay,
that's a
sure, let's start with that.
a pretty good example. So Faces in the Crowd, our budget was around 13.5 million, 14
Canadian dollars, yeah.
Canadian dollars. So in that particular case, we had a distribution company that was selling international, a company called Voltage. Nicolas Chartier, who happens to be a Frenchman in LA, who we took the project to. And by the time when we knew we had Mila Jovovich as our star, we had about 5 months, 6 months that we could use her name in terms of selling the movie. So what Nicolas did is he pre-sold the movie to roughly 17% of the budget, 15 to 17%. So about $2.3 million in pre-sales. Now, those pre-sales are not cash. What they are, they're contracts. I think he sold it to maybe 8 or 10 countries. So let's say Wild Bunch, which is a buyer in Germany, let's say they pre-buy it for $500,000. What you get as a producer is a piece of paper. It's a deal memo that says, I'm prepared to buy it, but I'm not going to pay you until you deliver. So what you have to do as a producer is find somebody to interim finance that paper. So we had about $2.3 million of contracts, pre-sales, that we had to somehow monetize. I'll come back to the monetizing in a second. So that's roughly, let's just say for the sake of argument, 20% of the budget. We also had a private investor in Faces of the Crowd out of the UK. And this was somebody who was a single individual who was very wealthy, who decided to put money into the movie and invested, I think, another 20% of the budget in the movie. So very fortunate that we found an individual. We also had a Canadian private investor put some money in, not significant, but significant enough that it definitely helped us get over the top. Then we had to find a gap lender. So a lot of times as independent producers, you never can get to the 100%. You have to monetize the unsold territories around the world. So our distributor gave us a sales projection, and it's a list that says low numbers and high numbers, and typically what you do, you take the number in the middle where you think you're going to end up at the end of the day after several years of selling, and you go and find a third party to monetize that unsold territories. So we call that gap financing, and we're fortunate in Canada we have a very strong gap lender out of Montreal called FIDEC. And FIDEC was our gap lender, and they put in 20%. So that 20%, they provided an LC, a letter of credit, and we had to find somebody else to interim finance that letter of credit. So now you've got a private sector investor, 2 of them. You've got your contracts on foreign. Then you've got your gap loan. And then we monetized our Canadian tax credits. So roughly 25% of the budget typically is what you can get depending on where you shoot it. We did a Canadian sale for roughly 3-4%. Producers actually invested about half of our fees to get there. and that's basically, and the director also.
That's the Canadian model.
Canadian model.
The French model, too.
And that's how we got there. The problem was when we actually got there, we had no cash. Nobody was putting any money up front, so we had to bring in an institution who basically interim financed almost the entire movie. Not just the Canadian pre-sale, which is easy to finance, but also all the foreign contracts. So we actually put it out to quote in France to a couple French banks, I believe, Courfeyrac and Courfeyrac. We also put it out to tender in Canada, and we ended up going with the National Bank of Canada. And the National Bank of Canada financed the gap, financed the tax credits, financed the pre-sales, financed a portion of the private investors, and the producers did a check swap in terms of our fees being reinvested back into the movie. So at the end of the day, we had a bank primarily interim finance the entire movie. So you can imagine our financing fees were very expensive. I think close to $1 million in financing and legal fees on a $14 million project. But we got the movie made. Banks made a lot of money, lawyers made a lot of money, producers didn't make a lot of money, but we're proud of the movie, and it was really our first, sort of thriller that kind of broke through in a sense. We'll have theatrical releases around the world. It won't be released theatrically in Canada or in the U.S. Millennium bought the U.S. rights. E1 bought the Canadian rights. And it'll go straight to VOD, Netflix, but we still got a 7-figure advance. And nowadays, be surprised how significant the advances are, even without a guaranteed theatrical release in the U.S. The system has changed so drastically. And now, just this announcement the other day is like Netflix is actually doing deals with studios for first-run movies that won't even hit theaters, and paying $30 million for those rights. So you're going to see in the next little while a lot of movies going straight to VOD and Blu-ray and pay TV and Netflix and those and iTunes that will bypass the theatrical. And the reason is because theatrical is very expensive to do. We had a test screening on Faces in LA. It tested very, very well. But we needed $25 million to do a theatrical release. And we knew that if we did a deal with a P&A fund, a prints and ads fund for that $25 million, we would have never seen a nickel. So do you take your $1 million+ for the VOD and those kinds of rights and put it in your pocket? Or do you do a big theatrical release? And sure, it feels great, and you can sit in the theater and say, I've got a movie in the theaters. But who would have made money on that is the lender who would have lent against the P&A. P&A funds take 20% off the top. U.S. distributor takes 10% to 15%. You've got your financing fees. The movie would have had to hit $55 million or $60 million in the box office to break even, just to get to the point of paying everybody back the theatrical release. So, it's not always the best thing to go theatrical. It just depends on the movie and.
Well, you raise a really interesting point. I think that traditionally people have said, well, even if you're not going to make money on the theatrical, it's advertising really for your film, and it drives the numbers then for DVD, for TV, and that sort of thing. And what you're saying is, even if it advertises a film, it doesn't necessarily make economic sense to have a theatrical release prior to going into these other markets.
Well, it depends. I mean, this movie was pre-sold to, by the time we got to production, I think we had pre-sold 13, 15 territories. Those deals are done. The prices have been set. So a theatrical release would have not taken up the dollar value. Now, there may have been overages in those territories. So if you sold Germany for $500,000 and you get a theatrical release in the U.S. and it's successful, sure, that person's theatrical DVD and VOD might be increased. But again, they take their 30%. They take their cost of sales. Distribution is like magicians. Let's face it. I mean, they're
Have you ever seen an overage?
No. Have you ever seen overages?
I've never paid one when I was in distribution either.
So
Yeah, you don't.
Sometimes, unfortunately, again, being independent, you need to almost make your sales up front and very quickly after you've released, because you never ever see overages from distribution.
Right.
And
Does everybody understand what overages are? Okay, just very quickly, you sell a territory, let's say Germany, as Kevin said, for $500,000. But the deal is that if they earn revenue that exceeds the $500,000 that they've paid for the film, then they'll actually give you more money. But in between the money they're earning and the money they're giving you are their distribution fees, interest very often, their costs for distribution, and a lot of other magical qualities that we're not really sure about, so that you never actually see any additional money from the initial payout that you get from the distributor. So it's a very interesting game, and I think that most producers have learned not to expect that there may be overages down the road from the sale. And as Kevin said, the idea is just to sell your film quickly, get those monies in, and not expect to ever see anything more.
With one thing is, within a co-production, at least in France, the co-producer gets his controls the distribution in his country. Doesn't mean he distributes himself the film, obviously, but he has a much better control. And you could see, a French producer could see overages with the French distribution.
Right.
Probably not within any other country, and it's possible that in Canada too. Maybe it's also a question of relationship with distributors, etc.
relationship,
But
right.
but if a film is very successful in Canada, I guess maybe you could see.
You know,
I
if it's
don't-
very successful in Canada, usually it means they spent a lot of money on prints and ads.
Right.
It's usually a lot of cost of sales. I mean, again, it's bait and switch.
Yeah.
I've never seen an overage in Canada on any of my films.
Well, once you get close as a distributor to the point where you're about to pay an overage, you'll just go take out more ads, and now it becomes corporate advertising.
Right.
Right? Rather than
Yeah.
pay an overage.
See, Sandra was working in distribution before, so she knows these tricks. Yeah. Now, Helen, I just want to ask you, I want to leave some time for questions. What's the latest we can go with this?
I think it's not so then 10:45 is wrap time.
10:45 is wrap time? Okay, so let's just get through a few other points, and then I'm going to open it up to questions. One of the trickiest parts of co-production that I found is matching up your creative points. And in general, what you have is requirements on both sides of the treaty co-production companies, countries that require you to match up your creative points, director, actors, that sort of thing, with the approximate split in your co-production. And so could you speak a little bit to that, Sandra, and then I want to hear how you guys have dealt with that.
Yeah, I mean, the underlying principle of treaty co-production is balance, financial and creative balance. So because you were doing most of your shooting in Canada, I'm assuming you were mainly majority Canadian?
80-20.
So 80-20. So 80% of the financing came from Canada, which means 80% of the spend should come from Canada, and 80% of the creatives, the creative crews, should come from Canada. So your key creatives are things like director, writer, your director of photography, your two actors, editor,
Designer, composer.
production designer, composer is often a way that you make up the minority. It's on the music line. That's the primary grid. So there's 10 points on a Cavco grid, 8 should come from Canada in an 80-20. Now, we do have a secondary grid. If you can't hit those within Canada, we have a secondary grid where we'll give you bonus for others, such as these assistant directors, stuff like that. There's a whole bunch of stuff, lyricist, big, long line that you can try to make that up.
So that gives you some flexibility
Yeah,
then.
some flexibility.
Is there also flexibility in the split itself? That is, if 80-20, can you go to 75-25, 70-30?
5% is about as much leeway either way. Of course, if you're let's say I'm in the minority, and so we're only putting in 20, but 30% of the spend's in Canada, I'm probably going to object to that, right? But the French might. So it's important to realize that the treaty partners have to issue together. It's a bilateral treaty. So I can't certify a Canadian treaty co-production unless the French are also willing to certify, and we release it at the same time. So we're always talking to each other. Are you ready? Do you see anything? And it has to happen together. So we have to be in agreement.
Okay. And so could you talk about how that's worked in practice and with your
Well, first,
co-productions?
just for a second, I'm going to speak about the French grids, because And then we can see how difficult it is to have the grids working together. So 80-20 was Faces in the Crowd, but the one we did before, Lullaby, was 60-40.
Yeah.
Always Canadian majority. We have two grids. I took the grids with me because they're a bit complicated. We have two grids in France. There's a European grid where you need to have 14 points out of 18. But as long as you're a treaty co-production, Canadians count as Europeans for this European grid. So usually there might be a problem with your lead actor if he's from a third country. But usually we get this 14 points out of 18 without too much problem. You also have a 100 points grid, which is the grid that I told you brings the fonds de soutien automatique, which is the money you get automatically from the theatrical release of a film into a special account. And out of these 100 points, you need to get 25. And this is only for French nationals. And this is where it gets complicated, because you might think that 25 out of 100 is not so much, but when you know there's 20 for French language, there's 20 for actors, there's 20 for where the movie is shot, it quickly goes down, and then you need to go with the Canadian grid. And so basically, we often have problems to attain these 25 points, especially when it's an English-speaking movie. And at the same time, it's exactly the same points we need and they need. So we don't fight, because that's not what we do. But we need to discuss and to have this very early into the process, so that we don't get stuck with points needed on the Canadian side that we need on the French side.
Well, and we learned our lesson on the first project, because we actually, prior to getting the treaty approval, made commitments to crew on both the French and the English side, and unfortunately, we had to backtrack on some of those contracts. So you can imagine the loss of face when you've hired somebody in France and you tell them that they can't come and you're not on the show. And so we learned that from that mistake very early to deal with it right up front. And it really is a horse trade, and it's a matter of sitting down and saying, okay, so where are we shooting the movie? Well, we're going to shoot it in Saskatchewan. Okay, so what are our strengths? And, you know, if we have some things, and if it's busy and there's other shows going on, and let's say, you know, there's only 2 first ADs in Saskatchewan that are any good, they're both working, then we would say, you know what, why don't you bring the first AD, because you get 5 points for that in France. So we sort of tend to look at where we're shooting the movie and what's available, what resources, and then kind of try to mold the co-production around what makes the most sense. At the end of the day, it's never perfect, and quite often one of us has to give something up. And so, I mean, we've had continuity come from France, we've had the AD department come from France, we've had a designer come from France.
Editors.
We've had editors, we've edited in France. So, you know, again, it's just a matter of lining up your...
We've had French editors go to Canada to edit, and we've had Canadian editors come to France to edit.
Because you get points for also where it's being edited separate to the editor. So it's literally, you have the 2 grids, you put them up on the wall, and you start filling it in, and you sort of add it up at the bottom. And good news is, on the Telefilm side, there's some flexibility, as Sandra was saying, is that if you have the majority of the crew that's not the creative crew, but more the technical crew, you actually get a 10% bonus on that grid. And that really helps you get over the top. So I think, and the reason why they've got that is because they want to encourage the money spent in Canada. And this is one way to get your foreign partners to agree, look, it doesn't make any sense to shoot downtown Paris, right?
For a lot of reasons, I
Well,
guess.
for a lot of reasons. It's expensive and, you know, traffic and all the rest of it. So if we shoot those French scenes, you know, somewhere else in Canada and use our crew, we can actually get bonused up, which helps us get to the grid. So that's just the creative grid. So let's assume you've got that done. You also then have to match it, what Sandra said, with the financial grid. So even if the financing is coming out of France, let's say it's an 80-20 Canadian majority project, but 50% of the money is actually coming out of Europe. What you have to do then when you do your deals is that the Europeans, rather than doing the deals and financing through the French company who they know and trust, you have to convince them to actually do their deals with the Canadian company and flow their funds to the Canadian company that they don't know and don't trust, which you really rely on your partner to be able to convince them that I'm trustworthy and you can send him 5 million euros, and don't worry about it.
It's actually easier after 3 films.
Yeah. So, again, it's very, very complicated. And all I can say is if you have any, if you want to do an international treaty co-production, first thing is you go to a market. Go to Cannes, go to Berlin, go to the UK, London market. Just get to Europe, get to a market, walk around, run into people, talk to them about their experiences, and just get over there so you can understand the nuances and the language barriers, the difference in how they shoot and how they want to shoot, how much control a French director has as compared to anywhere else in the world. It's phenomenal how much control French directors have on a project, which, buds up against the Canadian system somewhat in terms of, because, under the treaty, we do have a right to either approve or not approve a cut. So, again, it's somewhat complicated that way. But, and then once you sort of go to Europe and sort of experience it and get a sense of what it's about, you've got to find a partner who you absolutely can trust. And you can't do that unless you meet them face to face. I've done one co-production where I didn't meet my co-producer in the UK, and he actually left with the money. And the bond company took over in the UK. Luckily, it was not a project that I was asked to get involved because of a Montreal company that was going bankrupt, and they wanted to save this project. So I stepped in. This is years ago. And because it was already in the motions and in the works, the UK distributor left town and left unpaid bills and took the money. And that's the only project where I never met the co-producer. So absolutely, you want to spend the money to meet your partner and have a few dinners and meet their company and see their operation and meet their parents, whatever it takes to get a sense you're with somebody that you trust. Because every day is a nightmare in co-production. It really is. Yeah. But it's fun.
Well, on that note, let's throw it open for questions. There are people on both sides. Have we covered this so exhaustively that nobody has a question? Yes. You'll have to go to this person over here to ask your question, just so it can be recorded.
Oh, this is being recorded?
You did sign a release, didn't you?
Didn't have my glasses.
I'm Carol Whiteman with the Women in the Director's Chair program. Kevin, I have a question for you. We've sort of skirted around the whole system and the deferral of producer fees, et cetera, et cetera. You must be magic to have sustained a career over this amount of time. What is your secret? How do you actually sustain a career in the system that we're faced with?
Oh, boy.
The financial side of it, I mean.
Yeah, I mean, in the early years of Mind's Eye, we had a corporate commercial division, and we did commercials and corporate for 20 years. In fact, we still do the odd commercial. So having a corporate sort of, foundation helped pay the bills at one level. So we do less and less of that now. So that was important to have some other cash flow from somewhere. The key is to get into the habit of not having to defer or invest. And I think that, the system in Canada is quite helpful now in that area. They know how important it is to get those tax credits. If there's excess tax credits after you've paid the bills, that they do go to the corporation that deserves them.
Have you actually broken that habit?
Well, no. but I don't do 100% anymore.
Right.
When you get into trouble, if you have overages, often the producer has to step in. If you don't want the bond company to take over, the producer has to step in. I think part of it is just relationships with suppliers, with crew, with unions. You never have the cash and time to start a project. And I started shooting a movie on Monday called 13 Erie, which is about a $3.4 million movie. And, we're not closed. And we start shooting on Monday, so we've had to come up ourselves with $500,000 to pay the bills to keep going, because if you stop, the movie will die. I guarantee you. I've been there when if you don't force everybody to close, and you stop and say, we're going to wait 3 weeks, it'll never come back. Now, fortunately, the bank, again, the National Bank of Canada has been very good to us. I have a long-standing relationship. In fact, I have a debt facility of $45 million with the National Bank of Canada that I can access on projects.
But I
And-
suspect you had to build that over time. That
Oh, yeah.
doesn't happen
No,
instantly.
this is 25 years, and, we're still not there yet in terms of being able to automatically say, let's go. So, you need a good banker who will cash flow. So Charlene at the National Bank has cash flowed us $200,000 on 13 Erie prior to closing. And, there's a certain amount of trust there for a bank to do that. They have a corporate guarantee from us. I mean, it's not as if they're not secured, but there is that trust. And to be quite frank with you, we use a lot of credit cards. And I have done that from day one. And credit cards, if you have credit cards that don't have limits, and you build those up over time, I've been in a situation, I've had, 400,000 on my personal credit cards. And you don't want to do that unless you know and have the confidence that a project's going to go forward. But if you have no choice and you want to be in this business, you have to make sacrifices. And it's not for the lighthearted. It really isn't. You really have to be passionate about wanting art, that you're wanting, stuff to be seen, and otherwise just don't go into business.
So it's a lot of debt chasing as well,
Carol,
is what
we
I'm
need to-
hearing too.
Yeah, definitely debt. Everything's about debt. It's all interim financed. If you're not a studio or don't have a relationship with the studio, and some of you might say, well, you've got big stars. Why aren't you doing studio deals? Well, the studio deal is that they take the project over,
Right.
and you've got some 22-year-old who's been an assistant for somebody for a few years, now in charge of your project. And for them, it's just all about the money, and it's just about getting it done on time and on budget. And yes, they cash flow it, but then you end up with nothing. You don't own it. You have no copyright. You're basically a service for hire producer, and some people enjoy that, and they probably do way better than we do financially as an individual. But it's not.
It's a different model, isn't
It's a
it?
different model. It's
Yeah.
not building something, and I've
There's a
always. Yeah.
question up there.
Just one quick question.
Oh, yeah.
One quick question here first. Nicholas, we spoke last night about the the revised French tax credit, and you were telling me something entertaining about the origins of the French tax credit. Could you share that?
The new Woody Allen French tax credit. So,
Oh yeah, that's right.
so basically, we have this tax credit in France, which is only for movies which are shot in France, which are up to 20% of the budget, and which are only for French producers, which can work within a co-production, but the movie has to be shot in France. Hence this, we never accessed it ourselves with our co-productions. And 3 years ago was set up a new international tax credit for foreign producers that we called the Woody Allen tax credit, because Woody Allen was in Paris. He wanted to shoot his next movie in Paris, which is called Midnight in Paris. You obviously heard of it. And so it is said that the tax credit was more or less tailored around the wants of Woody Allen to be able to shoot in Paris, because Paris is very expensive. And because there was no such incentive for foreign productions in France. And basically what this tax credit does, it's also 20% on eligible spends, which are most of the spends, save actors up to a point, and hotels, oddly. And it's up to 4 million euros, I guess.
Per project.
Per project, yes.
That's pretty good. There's a question up there.
I guess this question really is for Sandra.
What?
What?
We actually need you to use the microphone, please.
Okay, well, there it's on. What are the top, say, 3 mistakes you're seeing new producers consistently come in with over and over again?
For co-production certification or for financing?
New producers, what are they doing that's wrong over and over again that you're seeing?
They don't read the guidelines. Boy, that's a tough question. New producers. At a co-production level, you're not seeing new producers. It doesn't make sense to do a co-production for what, like under $5 million, would you say, Kevin? Like,
No.
it just doesn't make sense because the legals will kill you alone. So you don't come in as a new producer with a $10 million film. We don't see it. Track record is a big part of when we're deciding on financing a film. We have to have that trust issue too. We have to know that they can deliver. Telefilm can put $4 million into a film. That's a lot of money for the Canadian financial system. And And so you wouldn't get financed without a track record at that level. But I just think do your homework, and if you're a new producer, try to find an executive producer, try to find someone who can help you navigate the waters, because what works for Telefilm might not work for Saskfilm, or it might not work for Hilda Greenberg Fund, or you've got to put all those pieces of the puzzle together. So I always say try to find a mentor, even if they're not in an official executive producer capacity.
And the other approach, obviously, is to start with very small projects and work your way up, because that's how you get your experience. Yeah. There's a question here.
Hi, this one's for Kevin. Earlier you were talking about how you get scripts submitted by new writers all the time. What's the number of scripts that you buy from new writers?
I would say that on average we get, I'm maybe guessing a little bit, 500 scripts submitted a year that are unsolicited, or that are maybe a phone call to our head of development and then submitted. If you just email me a script and there's been no conversation with anybody in my company, we just email you back saying we don't accept unsolicited scripts. So that's number one. I never refuse a phone call. I have never, ever not picked up my phone. That's one of my, what I'm known for, is that anybody can phone me and I'll answer any question about anything to do with the business. And if you, as a writer, call me and say, I've got a thriller, it's a really strong script. I've been told by that from practice and a few other organizations, and right away I would send it to my head of development and say, please read this script. So there's opportunity to come in, but you've got to make contact with the company. We would turn down 99% of the scripts, because let's face it, it's very difficult to finance anything, and the script has to be outstanding to get interest from a top director. It certainly has to be outstanding to get interest from a star. Right now we have, just to give an example, we have 35 projects in active development. So, and those are projects where we've paid option fees of $1 on some cases. Some option fees I'm paying $5,000 a year. Case of Last Crossing, I'm paying $10,000 a year for the rights to that book. So it really depends on the project and how passionate we are, and if we think we can get it made. And quite often now, when something comes in that has the potential to be a co-production with Europe, I send it to Nicholas and Jean-Charles. And for instance, I just sent them a Western. That's a project that I'm doing with Kiefer Sutherland, Donald Sutherland, Gary Housen's my co-producer out of Ontario. It's a pretty good script, budget around 10, 12 million. Canadian director, Canadian, everything Canadian, except the writer is French, believe it or not. Everything else is Canadian. So we thought it would make a great French co-production, because the writer's from Paris. Well, turns out Westerns are not that easy in France. And True Grit being the exception, because it was just such a phenomenon worldwide, because it had a brand. So that's automatically how I'd get feedback if this is a possibility as a European co-pro. And it came back, and Jean-Charles says, this is going to be tough. So right away I've kind of put that to the side and trying to finance it now, maybe as a UK co-pro, or an American pre-sale finance kind of a project. So it really just depends on the
Just quickly on scripts, if you have any package to come with the script, say a director, a lead actor,
that's very true.
Some track record for the screenwriter, but ideally the best for us is a director being attached and already involved in the process. Not only will we read it much faster, but also the project is more alive with a director being attached.
Or if you have a letter from a Canadian distributor, just an interest letter saying, we've read it, we think this is kind of cool. Find a senior partner, we might consider it. I mean, again, it's very difficult to get a Canadian distributor on a movie, in Canadian movie. There's only 2 in Canada that do, the level that we're doing. And you either get Alliance or you get E1, and there's really nobody else in between on sort of $10 to $20 million movies. And without a Canadian pre-sale, that's pretty tough to finance a movie. Because I think Telefilm requires it in terms of Telefilm financing, right?
Yeah, for the Canada feature film, you have to have a theatrical commitment.
If you don't have a theatrical commitment, you won't get a nickel from Telefilm. So now that Alliance just bought no, sorry, now that E1, no, Alliance bought Maple.
Yeah.
So now that Alliance has bought Maple, there was 3 distributors, and we actually, our projects were spread around the 3 of them. So we always tender to all 3, and we see who rises the quickest. And now we have to go to only 2. And Alliance, because they took over Maple's library, they have like 10 or 15 movies from Maple that have to be released, plus their own Canadian movies, and they're just not looking at financing new movies right now unless you've got a huge star.
I'm going to have to cut us off.
Yeah.
I'm getting the signs from everybody here. A couple of things. First of all, I just want to thank the panelists. You guys have been great, Nicholas, Sandra, Kevin, and could we just have a hand for these guys?